Imagine being part of the biggest band in music history, and still being willing to say, years later, that one of your own albums simply wasn't good enough. That was George Harrison. For much of his career, Harrison carried the reputation of being the quiet Beatle. John Lennon was known for his sharp wit and rebellious attitude. Paul McCartney was the charismatic frontman and natural communicator. George often appeared more reserved. But quiet never meant passive. When George had an opinion about music, he could be remarkably direct. And when he looked back on the Beatles' years, he wasn't interested in protecting the perfect image fans had created around the band. He was willing to separate the mythology from the music. In a 1977 interview, Harrison was asked about the Beatles' catalogue, and his answer was surprisingly blunt. He admitted that there were Beatles albums he simply didn't think were very good. And one title stood out: Yellow Submarine. Released in January 1969, Yellow Submarine was unlike most Beatles albums. It was created largely in connection with the animated film of the same name, and instead of presenting a full collection of new Beatles recordings, the album contained only 6 previously unreleased Beatles songs. The rest was made up of orchestral material composed and arranged by George Martin. For George Harrison, that distinction mattered. The Beatles had spent years transforming the album from a simple collection of singles into something much more deliberate. Their strongest records had an identity. They had a mood. They had a flow. They felt like complete artistic statements. Yellow Submarine, by comparison, didn't have that same sense of unity. And Harrison wasn't afraid to say it. But there was another part of the Beatles' catalogue that bothered him even more. And this time, the problem wasn't really the music. It was what happened to the music after the Beatles had already created it. To understand Harrison's frustration, you have to go back to the 1960s and look at how Beatles albums were released in America. British and American versions of Beatles records were often very different. Capitol Records, the band's American label, frequently changed the albums before releasing them in the United States. Songs could be removed, singles could be added, the running order could be completely rearranged, and sometimes, recordings from different Beatles projects were combined into an entirely new American album. To the record company, it was business. To Harrison, it was something else. It meant taking music that the Beatles had carefully assembled and changing the way listeners experienced it. One of the most famous examples was Yesterday and Today. For American fans, the album became part of the Beatles' experience. But Harrison later looked back at those American releases with obvious frustration. He explained that while the Beatles were creating 2 albums in Britain, American releases could effectively turn that material into 3. Songs were taken away, sequences were changed, and new packages were created. And Harrison wasn't exactly impressed with the results. His criticism wasn't that the songs were bad. Quite the opposite. Many of the recordings included on Yesterday and Today came from some of the Beatles' most respected albums, including Help, Rubber Soul, and Revolver. The problem was the way those songs had been pulled apart. Imagine spending months creating a painting, carefully choosing every detail and every color, only to have someone cut pieces out and rearrange them because they think the new version will sell better. That's essentially what Harrison believed was happening to the Beatles' albums. And there's one album that makes his point especially clear: Rubber Soul. Some people might hear Harrison criticizing the American Beatles releases and assume he was also dismissing Rubber Soul. He wasn't. In fact, Harrison considered it one of the Beatles' greatest achievements. Years later, he described Rubber Soul as the best album they had made and remembered that the band knew they were creating something special. And there's a reason. Rubber Soul represented a major change in the Beatles' evolution. The band was moving away from straightforward pop music and becoming more adventurous. Bob Dylan's influence encouraged deeper and more personal songwriting. Folk music opened new musical doors. The studio itself became an instrument. And suddenly, the Beatles weren't simply trying to make another hit record. They were trying to discover what else they could do. George Harrison was right in the middle of that transformation. During the recording of Norwegian Wood, he introduced the sitar into Beatles music. That moment wasn't just an unusual experiment. It opened the door to a completely different musical world for Harrison. Indian music would become an important part of his artistic identity, eventually influencing his solo work and changing the sound of several Beatles recordings. So when Harrison criticized certain Beatles releases, he wasn't rejecting experimentation. He wasn't saying every song had to sound the same. And he certainly wasn't trying to erase the band's achievements. He was defending something he believed was important: the integrity of the music. By the middle of the 1960s, the Beatles were no longer thinking about albums as random collections of songs. The sequence mattered, the atmosphere mattered, the timing mattered, the songs belonged together. A Beatles album could tell a story without literally telling a story. Change the order, remove a track, or combine songs from different projects, and you could change the entire experience. That's why Harrison's comments are so interesting. He wasn't simply being negative. He was revealing how seriously the Beatles took the records they created. And that also explains why Yellow Submarine stood out to him. The issue wasn't necessarily that every individual song was worthless. It was that the album didn't represent the Beatles in the same complete way as records such as Rubber Soul, Revolver, or Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. For Harrison, there was a difference between a collection of Beatles material and a true Beatles album. That distinction is easy to miss today, because decades later, almost everything connected to the Beatles has become part of music history. Albums that were once considered imperfect are now treated like treasures. Songs that were once overlooked are analyzed frame by frame. And every Beatles recording seems to carry legendary status. But George Harrison didn't always see things through that nostalgic lens. He had been there. He had lived through the recording sessions. He knew how the songs were created. He knew which decisions were intentional, and which ones were made for reasons outside the band's artistic vision. That's why his criticism carries so much weight. He wasn't an outsider judging the Beatles. He was one of the people who helped build the legacy in the first place. And perhaps that's what makes Harrison's honesty so fascinating. He understood that loving the Beatles didn't mean pretending everything they released was perfect. Sometimes respecting the music means admitting where it fell short. Sometimes protecting a band's legacy means refusing to turn its history into a fairy tale. George Harrison spent years being called the quiet Beatle, but his silence was never the whole story. Behind that quiet personality was a musician with strong opinions, a sharp sense of artistic identity, and very little interest in pretending for the sake of nostalgia. He didn't need to praise everything the Beatles did. He simply wanted the music to be judged honestly. And maybe that's one of the most revealing things about George Harrison. He wasn't trying to protect the Beatles myth. He was trying to protect the music. If you enjoyed this deeper look into the Beatles and the stories behind their legendary recordings, make sure you subscribe to Josback Stage Tales. Because sometimes, the most fascinating music stories are the ones the legends themselves were willing to tell. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.